She never thought she'd be one of those people who felt alone in a crowded room. But it happened. Slowly, quietly, like fog rolling in before dawn. The texts stopped coming. The calls grew short. And even in the middle of conversations, she started feeling unseen. It wasn't sudden. It was just emptiness, disguised as routine. At first, she tried to fight it. Filled her calendar, kept herself busy, pretended she didn't care. But silence has a way of finding you, even in the middle of noise. And the more she ran from it, the louder it became. There were nights when she'd lie awake, watching the ceiling and wondering what went wrong. Why everyone seemed to move on while she stayed behind, waiting for something she couldn't even name. It wasn't that she wanted to be surrounded by people. She just wanted to be understood, to be known, not for what she did, but for who she was when the room went quiet. She prayed, but even her prayers began to sound different, shorter, softer. Sometimes they didn't have words, just tears that said everything her lips couldn't. And in that quiet, she began to question things she once believed so firmly. Was God still listening? Was anyone? Or had she finally reached the part of her story where she was truly on her own? It's strange how loneliness can trick you into believing you've been abandoned, when in truth, it's often the place where you're being rebuilt. She didn't know that yet. All she knew was that her heart felt heavy and her world had gone still. But somewhere in that stillness, something sacred was beginning. Because loneliness, she would later learn, is not always a punishment. Sometimes it's an invitation to listen, to let go, to see what you couldn't while the world was too loud. The ache she carried wasn't proof that God had left. It was proof that he was calling her deeper, into the quiet, into the waiting, into the parts of herself she had been too busy to face. The nights were the hardest. That's when the silence spoke the loudest, when the walls of her room seemed to echo back every doubt she tried to bury. But it was also in those same nights that something began to change. The tears came slower. The ache felt different, less like loss, more like surrender. And deep inside, where words could no longer reach, a small light flickered, faint, fragile. But it was enough. It would take her a long time to realize it. But that was the moment she stopped being alone. Not because someone walked in, but because she finally stopped running out. Because sometimes the light doesn't enter through joy. It enters through cracks, through the ache, the silence, the longing. And when it does, you start to see that even in the loneliest places, you were never really alone. So if you're in that place right now, if the nights feel too long and the silence feels unbearable, this is for you. Because loneliness doesn't mean you're forgotten. It means you're being called to remember that love doesn't always arrive with company. Sometimes it arrives with peace, and in time, you'll see the light you've been searching for was always with you, even here in your loneliness. It didn't happen all at once. It was little things at first. The unanswered messages, the promises that quietly faded, the way laughter in a room stopped including her. She told herself it was fine, that people get busy, that life changes. But deep down she knew something had shifted. She used to be surrounded by people, by noise, by plans, by movement. Now the days stretched long and silent. She'd wake up to a phone that didn't ring, to a quiet apartment that felt too big for one heart. And that's when the questions began. The kind that don't look for answers. They just ache. What did I do wrong? Was I too much, or not enough? Why is everyone else moving forward while I'm standing still? She tried not to ask, but the questions found her anyway, in the spaces between thoughts, in the stillness that never stopped echoing. There were moments she wanted to fix it, to chase people down, to explain herself, to prove she was still worth staying for. But something inside her whispered, "Don't. And that whisper was the beginning of something she didn't understand yet. The beginning of letting go. At first, letting go didn't feel peaceful. It felt like grief. Like learning to live without something you never thought you'd lose. Every silence felt like rejection. Every empty chair like proof that she wasn't enough. She cried more in that season than she ever had before. Not just for others, but for herself. For all the versions of her that tried too hard to be chosen. But somewhere between the tears and the quiet, a realization began to bloom. Maybe this emptiness wasn't punishment. Maybe it was preparation. Because sometimes God removes what's comfortable so you can finally see what's holy. Sometimes He empties your hands so He can place something eternal in them. She didn't know that yet. Not fully. But she could feel it. A soft, unexplainable peace. Just enough to keep her breathing. And even though everyone else had left, something sacred had stayed. Something she couldn't name but could feel in the quiet. A love that didn't leave when people did. And in that realization, the silence stopped sounding like loss. It started sounding like space. Space for healing. Space for grace. Space for her. The silence used to scare her. It used to feel like proof that no one was listening. Not people, not even God. But when you live long enough with silence, something changes. You start to realize it isn't empty. It's full, just not with the things you expected. At first, she tried to fill it. Music, messages, distractions. Anything to drown out the sound of her own thoughts. But everything she added just made the silence louder. Until one night, she finally stopped trying. She sat still. No phone. No words, no plans. Just her and the quiet. And for the first time, the quiet spoke back. It didn't sound like a voice. Not exactly. It was softer than that. A pull, a warmth, a presence that didn't demand anything. And in that moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Seen. Not by people, but by something greater. Something that had been there all along, waiting for her to notice. The silence began to change shape. It stopped feeling like loneliness and started feeling like company, like a place she could go to rest. And the more she sat in it, the less afraid she became of herself. Because the truth is, loneliness doesn't always mean no one's there. Sometimes it means you've been avoiding the only one who always was. In that stillness, she started to hear things she'd missed before. The steady rhythm of her breath, the beating of her heart, the whisper of grace that said, "You're not forgotten." It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was simple, but it was real. She realized that maybe silence isn't God's absence. It's His classroom. It's where He teaches you how to listen again. Not for the noise of the world, but for the voice of peace. The kind that doesn't shout to be heard, but waits to be received. And as she learned to listen, she began to heal. Not all at once, but gently, the way dawn replaces night. The silence that once broke her was now the same silence that rebuilt her. And she knew. If she ever felt alone again, she'd know where to go to find Him. She didn't hear it all at once. It wasn't a thunderclap or a revelation that shook her walls. It came softly, like a breath between heartbeats. A whisper that said, "You're not lost. You're being led." At first she thought she was imagining it, but the words stayed. And the more she listened, the clearer they became. It wasn't the kind of voice that told her what to do. It didn't give her directions or answers. It just reminded her of what was true, that she was loved, even here, that she wasn't forgotten, even in the silence. And for the first time in months, she believed it. The loneliness didn't disappear overnight. The room didn't suddenly fill with laughter or company, but something inside her shifted, like the ground of her heart finally steadying again. She realized she didn't need the noise anymore to know she mattered. because the voice inside her was louder than the silence around her. Sometimes it spoke in words, sometimes it spoke in peace, like when she took a walk in the cold morning air and felt the sunlight touch her face, or when she looked back on everything that should have broken her and realized she was still standing, still breathing, still here. That was the voice. Not in thunder, not in chaos, but in survival, in presence, in every quiet mercy that met her where she was. It didn't need to explain the loneliness. It just stayed with her inside it. And maybe that's what she'd been missing all along. Not people, not plans, but this. The gentle reminder that she was never walking alone. That even when no one answered, heaven still did. Every time she whispered, "Are you still there?" the silence whispered back, "Always." That voice didn't remove the ache. It redeemed it. It didn't erase her loneliness. It filled it with light. And from that day on, she stopped calling it emptiness. She started calling it prayer. She thought the light would come and go, that it would visit her heart for a moment, then fade like everything else that once made her feel alive. But it didn't. It stayed. Not as a burst of joy or sudden clarity, but as something steady. Something she could lean on when everything else felt uncertain. At first, she didn't notice the change. It was quiet, like most miracles are. The mornings didn't feel so heavy anymore. The nights didn't echo the same way. The silence still came, but it no longer frightened her, because she knew what lived inside it now. Light. She didn't have to chase it, didn't have to earn it. It simply met her where she was, in the middle of the same small apartment, with the same unanswered questions and the same quiet days. Except now, she saw them differently. The same four walls that once felt like a cage now felt like a chapel, a place where she learned how to breathe again, how to believe again, how to be. The light wasn't about fixing what she lost. It was about reminding her that she still had what mattered most: peace, purpose, and presence. It was gentle but constant. It stayed through the storms. It stayed when people came and went. It stayed when the tears returned. It stayed when she couldn't even see it. And that was how she knew it wasn't hers. It was his. Now she didn't rush to fill the quiet anymore. She honored it. Because she understood that the same silence that once broke her had become her sanctuary. And the same loneliness that once emptied her had become her altar. The light she found there wasn't a moment. It was a home. It didn't erase the ache completely, but it made it holy. It didn't take away her solitude, but it made her realize she was never truly alone in it. So she kept the lamp burning, in her heart, in her words, in the way she walked through her days, softly, slowly, but never in the dark again. Because when she found light in her loneliness, she discovered the kind that doesn't just visit, it dwells. She used to think silence was her enemy, that it came to remind her of everything she didn't have. But now she knows better. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was invitation. It wasn't punishment. It was presence, disguised in stillness. What the silence taught her was that love doesn't always sound like words. Sometimes it sounds like breath. Sometimes it feels like peace that comes out of nowhere. Sometimes it's simply the strength to wake up one more day and keep believing that life still holds beauty. There was a time she begged God to end the loneliness. Now she thanks him for it, because without it, she never would have learned how to hear his voice beneath the noise of everything else. She wouldn't have known that his love is quiet, but it fills every empty room. Loneliness taught her what presence truly means. That it isn't about who sits beside you, but who sustains you when no one does. That even when you have no one to talk to, you are still heard. That even when your prayers fall silent, they still reach heaven, because sometimes the tears are the prayer. She learned that strength doesn't come from never feeling alone. It comes from knowing where to turn when you do. And grace isn't always loud or visible. Sometimes it's simply surviving the night and finding a reason to smile again in the morning. Now, when she sits in the quiet, she doesn't rush to escape it. She breathes in. She closes her eyes. And she whispers, "Thank you for staying when no one else did." Because that's the truth she carries now. That loneliness was never the end of her story. It was the place where light began. And that light never left. It grew. It followed her. It filled her heart until it overflowed. She doesn't fear silence anymore. She lives in it. Because what the silence taught her was that she was never truly alone. She was being taught to see, to listen, to love again. And maybe that's the most sacred part of all, that the loneliness she thought would destroy her became the place where she finally met God.